In this application, we're going to look at MVC, and we're going to focus on models, where the definition of a model, where M is in MVC, represents essentially the real-world objects, processes, and rules that define the subject, also known as the domain of an application. So what we've got here is we've got an application, and this is closely aligned with the examples found in chapter 2 of this referenced textbook. So this is a book by Adam Freeman, Pro ASP.NET Core MVC, the 7th edition. It's by A Press. And if you look in chapter 2, you'll see several examples that are very similar to this. It's just been adapted to teach modeling in MVC. So the purpose of this application is, what it does is it collects information from people that are trying to RSVP to an event. It's a very generic application, so what I'll do is demonstrate what the application does, and then we'll look at how it's built inside of the MVC framework. So if we just run the application in Visual Studio on IIS, it will bring up a page, and this is based off previous examples I've posted on YouTube that show in MVC where we focused on views and controllers. So this example we're focusing on models. So we have a link here now. We click here to RSVP. We just fill out a form. So I'm going to put my name, and we'll just put my phone number. So we're not doing any form validation in this example. We're just trying to get through to demonstrate a model. So I fill out the phone number and will I attend? These are my options. Yes, I'll be there. And I click submit RSVP. It then says thank you. This is my name I filled out in one of the fields in the form. So I can click here to add another RSVP. So I'll put Vivian Daniel and an email. And we'll say that she's going to be there, RSVP. We can also add someone and say that they're not going to be there, but they won't show up on the final list. So put Carl Daniel. There we go. And say he's not going to be there. It just displays a different message here if they state that they're not going to be there. So it keeps track of the ones that will be there. If I click here to see who will be coming, notice that it stored those information, that data, in memory, and then displayed it here, and you'll see how that's done in the form of a list object and link in memory. And so we call upon that model, execute an iterative statement, and display what's stored in memory out here to the screen. So that's what our application does. So let's close the application. Now the entry point into looking at this design is, so we spent a lot of time on controllers and views in previous video. Here, just looking at the home controller, remember the controller is what hands off data from the model. So if you remember the flow, what happens is controllers are, the home controller is what's received first by the application. It's also when you see get and post actions from a form, they'll come through the home controller. So the home controller is where the application's entry point is, and then from the home controller, the controllers can talk to models, and models, you'll see, is where we structure and we can work with data, where we have a lot of the heart of our business inside of those models, and then they can pass information back through the controllers to the views and then render the information to the user. So the first place to look at, and if you were programming, and we'll have this code out on GitHub. So you can look at it in more detail. So if we look at this code here at the home controller, there is really 1, 2, 3, 4 calls to views. The first is just the index view. This is when the application is first loaded, it goes to the index view first, and all it does, you saw in previous videos where I discussed dynamic views from the controller. So here the controller is just getting the system date and time and displaying either good morning or afternoon depending on the time that's come back from the system. And so it goes to my view. So let's navigate to my view first, and we'll just navigate that way. So I've got over here underneath my views, I have a myview.cshtml, and on here I'm just displaying some HTML to the screen that just says the greeting from the view bag right here, this property that's available from this view bag object. And remember, that's just, we've had gone over this in previous video where this is just an object where you can assign any arbitrary property, and in this case it stores a greeting that said good morning or good afternoon world, and then it said let's RSVP for the party, and then you see some ASP code, ASP.NET code, and it's real simple. It's just conducting an action, an ASP action here on a view. And so that's what displays the hyperlink, because it's in an anchor tag. That's the HTML tag. And if I click on this hyperlink, it will locate this RSVP form view, which we will have over here in our views. We'll be looking at here in a minute. So what happens is when you click on that link, remember each time that a link is clicked and it goes to a specific view, everything is going to come back through the home controller in the application, and the controller says, okay, what kind of request just came in? So right now we have an HTTP GET right here attribute before this method, this RSVP form action method coming through the home controller that just says, okay, return the view. So it's going to locate under views in home, it's going to locate RSVP form.cshtml and render that page because I put this attribute here. Now I also down below have an HTTP post. So the difference is whenever you get requests from to web pages, either from forms or through a URL, an HTTP request can be a GET, which typically happens through links that go directly to resources, where posts typically come from actions executed on forms. Now either one can come from different resources, HTTP requests from different resources, but in this context we're going to use HTTP GET from a link and HTTP post from requests from the form. So given the fact that the user clicked on right here, they clicked on that from this my view, they clicked on this click here to RSVP now, it's going to try to render RSVP form, so it comes through the home controller. The home controller interrogates that HTTP request and recognizes it as GET request and returns the RSVP form view. So looking at that, we look at the view. Now here's what's interesting. The view, it has a form. We'll come back to this code up here in just a moment. Right here it says this at model MVC underscore models get response. We'll look at that in just a minute. What we've got here first is we just have an HTML form, And when we define forms in HTML, we define their actions. Now, since we're using the ASP.NET Core framework here, we can define its action on itself. So this is going to execute an HTTP post request. It's going to come back to itself each time. And here, these are just the fields that are available to the form. So we've got labels and we have input right here to identify each of those fields for input. So this is where essentially a text box where the user types in the information. We also have a select drop down with different options available to us. Notice that this is all written here in the ASP.NET format rather than the typical default HTML code there. So because we're scripting and we have to gather data, that's why we're coding it this way. And then we have a button at the bottom that's a submit button. And when the user clicks that button, it will execute a post right here on the data from the form. Now, the other thing that's interesting is what's available to this RSVP form view is up here we define a model. And so in MVC, we can create these C# files and we can define them as models in the MVC, where the MVC framework can use them within that context. So here we've got, so when we see this right here, MVC Models, that's just the name of our project. And then in that namespace, we have this models object. We have an object here called guest response. So if we look at right here, you can see under models, I've created this guest response.cs file. And looking at this file, notice that, you know, when we created this CS file, it has this dot models after it in the namespace. That tells it tells the MVC framework to recognize this as a model under the context of models. And so we have a class, and in that class we define here 3 strings, and these three strings have get and set accessors. So essentially similar to objects, where objects have properties and methods, and so classes can also have accessors. So we have this guest response that has these right here, these the availability to store the name, the email, the phone, and then we also have this will attend data type that's a Boolean. And what's different about this one with this little question mark is that this model can store these 4 values, and this model can store a Boolean will attend as either true, false, or it will allow null, which is kind of interesting. So again, these are all set as public so that other classes can access them and use this model. And so if you could just think about this as the heart of the application, where we're going to bind this model to the form. And so when we come back over here and we look at this RSVP form that's here in this CSHTML file, where we have that guest response, that model available to us, and we can bind those things together. So what happens is when the user clicks the RSVP button, remember everything goes back through the home controller, whether there's a get or a post HTTP request. So we go back through to the home controller and we go down and we see, okay, this time the user, if we look here, and let's go right here to HTTP post. So this being an attribute on the post coming back to the application, this time, before we had that RSVP form on a GET request, but this time we have it on a POST request. And what we're allowing this time is we're allowing the RSVP form view, we're allowing it to pass what was collected in the post from this guest response model. And so we just give it a name here, the lowercase guest. And so we pass essentially everything that was collected through the binding of that form to the model. We pass it here, and so we have the data that the user has filled out, and what do we do with it? Well, we then access an object that we created in our project called repository. So under models, we handle that data right here in this repository object that I created. And what this object does here is this class and all of its members are static, which will make it easy to store and retrieve data from different places in the application. And what we're doing here in this repository is we have a list object that's used to keep track of all of the responses. And that's what we have here. We call it responses. And we create an instance of this list in memory, and we store in that list all of the data collected from the guest response model. And then all we need to do then is we get that information, and we have a method available to us right here called add response. We pass the information that we get from the guest response object that we're perpetually using this list object, and all we do is we just have an add method here where we add those values right here in memory each time that the user executes that post. Okay, so that's what we do here in this repository each time. So let's go back to our home controller. So again, we access our repository object, we execute the add response method, and we pass to that method the data that we've collected from our guest response model. After we do that and we've added it in memory, all we're doing here then after that post is we return a view that says thanks, and we also send it whatever data was available from the model, because you'll see how we'll use it in the thanks view. So we're calling a view called thanks, and we go over here to the thanks view, and here it is. Now because we sent right here, because we sent the guest response model and we made it available to thanks, we can reuse it again. Isn't that nice? So we said thank you, we access that model, and we access a specific field in the guest response data model called name, where we collected the user's name, again, that was bound to that form. So that's how we're able to just say thank you at model and access the name that the user entered. And then all we're doing here is a logical test, and we're just saying, hey, we just want to display one message or the other, whether the user in the drop down with will attend, if they said that they would attend, and that value we said if we looked at the RSVP form here, we said that if yes, I'll be there, we assign that value as true. If we say no, I can't come, if the user selects that, we assign the value false. If they just choose an option, they don't choose anything, there's nothing in that value. So we're either going to have true or false if the user selects the form. Again, we're not doing any form validation, but if the user selects one of these and we go to thanks, we say, well, okay, if in the model if will attend is equivalent to true, then display this message that says it's great that you're coming, we look forward to it. Else, we just say sorry to hear that you can't make it. And then down below, we then displayed two links, one that said click here to add another RSVP form. So again, we're leveraging that ASP.NET action where we can call a view RSVP form. Remember, if we're clicking on links, those are going to be HTTP GET requests, where it just goes straight to a view, versus a post. So here we could go directly to the RSVP form view again, or we can also call the list responses view. So let's take a look at that. If we come back through the home controller, we have one more option. If we're calling, remember, each time a get or a post happens, it always comes back to the home controller. So in this case, if the user clicked list responses to go to the list responses view, which we'll look at in a minute, we're doing something pretty interesting here. So we created a view that allows us to go get the data that we have in memory. So the list response action method is used to go get those responses from memory and display them. So here, the list response action method, it calls the view method using this repository.responses, which we'll look at in just a moment, property as the argument. So let's go look at our responses. So the view is going to call the responses. So we created over here another model, a responses under models. Let's look at the logic in this code. Again, here, it's in the namespace of models. Okay, so every time we add any of these in the models area, they're always going to fall under the namespace of the project here, and then it's going to be classified in the models of the namespace. So let's look at this. So what's happening in here? Well, this class and its members, they're static again, which makes it easy to retrieve. And so here, this is where we access our repository, which we looked at before. So let's go to the list responses right here. So again, going back to the home controller, we're going to that repository where we iterate through, we looked at this before, where we iterate through what's available inside of this object. Pretty cool. And we can execute this. Look at this. So we can access that object, that model, and we can run a query on it, that using link, L-I-N-Q. And all this is here is a link query that filters out where we look at if the user entered. So you saw in my example, 2 people were coming to the event and 1 person was not. In this case, we're only looking for those people that have RSVP'd that are coming to the event. Pretty cool. So we execute this query against, we interrogate the repository object, and again we're going to render the list responses review. So we go to the list responses review. We've gathered up that data, and since we have that data, we can then loop through what data is available right here. We have a for each loop. So all we're doing on this HTML file is we've set up here a table tag. It's got some table headers. Essentially, these are the name, the email, and the phone, the column headers, and then right here it just renders the data underneath each of those column headers. And so we run a loop, a for each loop, through what data is available in the model R here that has been filtered through the link query, and we just get, each time we iterate through it, we display the name, the email, and the phone. And so again, in summary, let's look at the entire flow again. So that's all of the code that's included in this application. So let's run it through again one more time. So we run the application, brings us into the home controller, displays the index view, which just says good afternoon, let's RSVP. I click that link. It then takes us to the RSVP form. That phone number in there, my email. And I'm just going to say that I'm coming to the event. And instead of adding another one, I'll just go ahead and show you the end result. Let's click here to see who's coming. And then it goes to that list responses, and there is my data. Again, we'll have all of this code up on GitHub, so you can look at all of the code and review as you look through this video, so that you can make those connections and it makes sense.